Hi, and welcome to F-World, the Fragility podcast. Together with our guests, we explore how the force of fragility manifests across the world and in our day-to-day lives, and how we can build a more resilient future. I'm Mihaela Karstey, and I'm joined by my two co-hosts, Paul Biska and Johan Bjurman-Bergman. And today we are speaking with Hannes Mueller. Hannes is a tenured researcher at the Institute for Economic Analysis, which is a research center of the Spanish National Research Council. He also directs the master's program in data science for decision-making at the Barcelona Graduate School of Economics. Professor Mueller is somewhat of a polymath. He has interests that are diverse, ranging from machine learning, political economy, development economics, conflict studies, and industrial organizations. However, most recently, his research focus has been on how conflict can be predicted using millions of newspaper articles, which is a project that you can find at conflictforecast.org. This research project has become a key resource for global work on conflict prevention and has led to collaborations with the Spanish Central Bank, the German Foreign Office, the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the UN, World Bank, and many, many others. Hannes, welcome to F-World.
Thank you for inviting me.
So first, we want to get to know our guests. We always want to know, how did you come to where you are today? Where did you grow up? Why did you become interested in conflict, in data science, in topics that seemingly are quite varied? So tell us a little bit about you, your story.
I am German. I didn't grow up in a very fragile context. It's quite the opposite, I would say, in the countryside in Germany, southern Germany. I studied economics, and as my diploma thesis, I studied the transition in Russia and Poland, and perhaps this was my first encounter with something I would call fragility. So I studied the reforms, shock therapy basically, and my question was, why did it work in Poland and why didn't it work in Russia? Then I moved on to Switzerland. I did an internship at UNCTAD and did some field missions in Nepal on like trade in SMEs, but there was no fragility element there. And then I moved to a PhD at LSE, and kind of my intellectual starting point in fragility studies was a joint paper with Tim Besley, where we studied the end of the conflict in Northern Ireland with the peace agreement. And we did this through housing prices. So we looked at housing prices. And that was kind of like the beginning of a long journey, I would say, intellectually and kind of my personal interest, reading more and more about this issue. And that led me to kind of the way you characterized me now. But it started that way, I would say.
I'm curious, what was the outcome of your PhD paper? Why did the shock therapy work in Poland and not Russia?
So that was my diploma. So it was like a time when, in Germany we didn't have Bologna yet, and it was we had 5 years to study or not study. And I actually, the outcome, I found these, so Eurostat or some European statistics office actually ran surveys in Eastern Europe at the time, Central and Eastern Europe at the time. And they were really interesting because you could see that the Polish population was really in favor of markets, right? So there was like a big majority, 80% or something like this, were in favor of market. And then when shock therapy hit, this went down to, I would say, something like close to 50%. So maybe 60 or 55% were in favor of markets. And then it rebounded. And in Russia, it started out and it's like 60% in favor. And then when the reforms hit, 30% in favor and 70% against. And so I think this tells you like the starting points were so different in terms of what people thought. And even if it was not a purely functioning democracy, I think in the end the outcomes were not so opposed to what actually the population thought. So my conclusion in a way is that it's actually kind of politics filtering through. It's a bit like, my saying, I think a little bit I was finding my feet as an economist in this, and it was a bit like it's the politics stupid. No, it's as opposed to like it's the economy stupid. It's a bit. I ended up saying like it's really hard to pin it to purely economics things, and I ended up saying like probably politics.
So at the very beginning of your career as an economist, you, in a way, delved straight into politics, straight into society and social issues. And in other words, almost straight into those things that are usually harder to quantify. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious, how has this early onset, this view of the world for you, influenced the thread that kind of binds together all your different interests? I mean, you look at machine learning, you look at very technical things, and yet you sort of keep this angle. How has that developed at some point as you've learned more about, let's say, the classical technical tools of an economist through your PhD and later through your research?
I think I find politics fascinating, interesting, and I mean, my father was a member of parliament, so at our kitchen table it would always be about politics. So all the conversations were about politics, and so I think that this is kind of like something that is I carry with me inherently. But then why does this carry through to my work? I think that I've always found that thinking about kind of these political systems and how the economy interacts with politics and how it interacts with the social aspects of life are very healthy things to think about for economists, because I think economists have like a reputation for being like cold-hearted, rationalizing. And I think that's very often very unfair, because there's a lot of work inside economics that tries to kind of think about the political process and takes it very seriously. And so I think that I really place myself inside that stream inside economics. But I think that's not like, it's not like a small fraction. I think there's it's not that. It's mainstream, basically. It's the part of the mainstream inside economics that does this, right? So you have this revolution in 2001. That was when I kind of grew up intellectually at LSE in a way, with the papers by Atsumoglu and Robinson Johnson, right, about the role of institutions. And this was something that when I wrote my diploma, I already had like as a notion, right? So it's really important, this thing, right? There was already the seeds of these papers were already laid much before, in the 90s. And so then somebody finds an instrument and pins it down, and everybody's like, oh my God, there's causal identification here, right? And I think that to me led to this kind of, I was really part of that group or part of that intellectual group of people that carried that into economics and was very optimistic about like that you could figure out causality. So sticking to our framework and still take these things into account.
That's, I think, a fascinating thing. Just listening to you, I reflect upon the fact that in my studies of development economics and fragility, I've always assumed that it's always been about institutions. But clearly, of course, it hasn't. But it's great to get that perspective on it, I think. Another aspect that I found fascinating in your paper on the fiscal state capacity and kind of the connecting that to institutions was this example of the interplay between institutions and norms, and the idea of the parking tickets for the diplomats in New York, and kind of how that shows the power of institutions, but also the weakness of institutions unless the incentives are aligned between the institutions and the actors. So how should we think about kind of the institutional institution formation and as it relates to fragility and particularly perhaps as it relates to fiscal capacity as you discuss in this paper and how should we think about these topics? What's your entry point?
So I have to say that, you know, I'm really following Tim's view on this. So it's definitely not I'm like the spearhead in this line of thought. You know, if you look at Tim Besley's work and Thorsten Person's work, I think that you see this strong stream of state capacity, and then now they're basically to that framework they're adding these cultural aspects, right? And so the paper that you read, this chapter in this IMF compilation, I think is kind of a brainchild of that stream of work, and you know, it was very fascinating for me to see people interact in the writing of this compendium, because there was an understanding in the room, or at least for most people, that, you know, I think Paul Collier always was repeating this to the room. He said, like, you know, if you are thinking about fragile contexts, you can't take Denmark as your example, because it's too far away. There's too many things that are different on too many levels. You will not find the path to Denmark, right? Because there's just like so many complementary things that need to happen, that it's very hard to see that path. And so that influenced me heavily, I have to say, on the work of how to get out of fragility. I think it's very useful to think about next steps and have like some idea where you're going, but to be very pragmatic and try to kind of see how you can generate peace best by taking the baby steps towards one direction, and then to be aware that there is a lot of complementary things that can happen and need to happen, right? So just to give this example of culture and institutions, when I arrived, and I'm just going to, you know, bring this out of fragility more to my own life context, right? So I'm generalizing brutally now, but like when I arrived in Spain as a German, there was a lot of like people saying like, why are you paying these taxes, you know, or people being very proud that they were taking unemployment benefits and having like a nice time with it, right? And like saying like, oh, we're showing the state, oh, this is, you know, haha. And I was taught, I mean, but we are, like we others here, we're sitting around the table, we are the state, we are paying you, right? So, and I think it's this awareness of like, what you are doing with your tax money is to the benefit of everyone. And if you're shirking off, then that harms everyone, right? But I think this is something that is built. And I think that what kind of Tim and Thorsten are saying is that actually, fascinatingly, this is built by charging people taxes and providing public services. Because the moment you go and knock on their door and say like, you didn't pay tax, you better pay tax, right? They will be, oh, okay, damn it, I got caught, I need to pay tax, right? So then they start paying tax, and then the moment they start paying tax, they're looking at their friends and think, he's not paying tax, why am I paying tax, right? And so then there starts to be like this game changes, and people socially enforce this, right? So there's a reinforcement mechanism that starts to bite, where people are like, why aren't you paying tax? I'm paying tax. And so this is working. So this is like, seems very abstract. Now I'm going, you know, now I'm doing the Denmark mistake, right? So, but It's not like, so, Raul de las Sanchez has done this, has run RCTs in Congo where people are, the taxman cometh, right? And knocking on doors and looking at the reaction of people and how they're reporting. And it has exactly the social effect that when you have this interaction with the state and it's not terrible, then people are improving their attitudes towards paying taxes, right? And they expect more public services in return. So if you fail with the public services in that moment, and if there's corruption scandals in that moment, then you kill everything, right? So you're coming, people are like motivated, they're looking at you, and then you better don't fail them, right? If you fail them in that moment, then everything falls to pieces because they're just going to be upset that they got taxed and they receive nothing in return. So it's this give and take, like throwing public services immediately at people and showing them that something is done with this money is like an incredibly important aspect of this building this trust, right? And I do think that's the way out.
So actually, I hope we can go a little deeper in this, because what's the temporal aspect? So you just described, okay, you pay taxes and then you expect public services in return, and you better not fail to give those public services. However, many, many times governments fail at that step. And then, so I have sort of two separate questions emerged. First, how fast do you need to see the services in order to build the trust? And then the second question that emerged in my mind was, okay, if you fail, then the level of trust will go lower than it was previously. It's almost like the baseline moves down, and you get caught in a lack of trust trap if you do this several times.
Yes.
So how do you dig yourself back out? And do you have to first show a track record of being able to deliver before you're asking for more money? And I'm thinking here in the countries that have been doing this sort of repeated causal loop almost over decades. So yeah, first question, how soon do you need to see the results? Because you have two people born in Romania and one in Sweden that you're talking to today. So we have a very different perception of how efficient government is with taxes.
So first of all, let me say that, because people, I think, always think when somebody says culture, people always say think like singing, like telling fairy tales, and like until when has everybody switched like in fairy tales they're telling? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is like attitudes towards something, and I think these can change very, very, very fast. I think it's surprising in a way how fast these things can change. Smoking, right? In my lifetime, and actually in my being here within a decade, the attitude towards smoking in Spain has changed dramatically. And in the US, I'm sure you'll see the same. In Sweden, I'm sure it's the same. I don't know what it is in Romania, but like in generally speaking, I think there is no shaking your head. No, I think there's there's these things, right? And this is just one example. There's other examples that are where it's changing very fast. So I do think these things can change very fast. Then how quick do you need to be in order to change the situation? I think you can usually take your time. I think just generally speaking, the question is a bit more like how fast can you be, right? I mean, are the incentives of the political actors aligned to actually then go and provide these services, right? And that's where it usually fails. It's just like maybe the IMF forces them to in the stabilization pact, right? So to collect these taxes, but then like there's no structure to actually deploy all these public services.
No capacity.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so and nobody wants to build this capacity either, right? So I think I see that much more the problem as like the timescales are not right. It's more like it never comes. Like if you would, like it never happens. And I think there's one example where it needs to happen very fast. There's this, again, Raul de las Sanchez has this really interesting study of Eastern Congo. where he shows that armed actors are much better in taxing and providing public services because, they do everything at once. They move in and then they provide justice services. It sounds absurd, but, there is some base layer of like, don't steal, right? And so there will be some provision of services when they become stationary, the stationary bandits, right? If they become stationary bandits where they provide these services.
Is it almost subsidiarity? They're closest to the people. They're right there in the space.
I think it's that, but I think it's also like it's a smaller organization, and it's not that it's the army, right? So it's like these armed groups and the army fighting it out, right? And the army comes in and says, like, we're not providing justice services, right? We're not doing that. What we are doing is like providing security. So they're going in and they're like, okay, security established, right? And then nothing else happens. And people are lucky if it's actually security, right? So, so it's also not imperfect security provided by the state, but then nothing else. And, until the bureaucracy reaches these places, it just takes forever. And so I think in these circumstances, what I would consult people to do is like, have a truck of something come right the first day when the military arrives, right? And say, hey, we're going to do registration of land, or we're going to do, something that people care about, or like we're going to look at the well immediately, right? So I think this is where when you're competing, right? When you're not the only one, when you're competing, you better be fast, right? Because the others are fast.
So let's switch for a second. Let's go back from DRC to Spain. And I have two questions in mind for you, because you basically started with the following story. You said, people were not paying their fair share, and they looked at this as a victory against the state. Like, look what I'm doing with my taxes. I won in a way. But what they didn't say, at least most of them, was we're going to go and build a different state. And on that state, we're going to pay taxes. Now, this is interesting because just a few years ago, before all of us were focused, before all of us worried about Ukraine, Spain, in a way, was one of the epicenters of fragility in Europe, with possible independence in Catalonia, with the history of the Basque movement and others. So then, how would you reflect on what helped Spain kind of avoid that moment, navigate through that fragility moment? And ultimately, for you as a researcher, what is fragility? How do you define it? How do you measure it? How do you understand it? And where are the places that you think, or the aspects that you think international organizations and actors who are working on this issue have done well, and where they need to improve?
So this is a two-pronged question that is interesting, because it's like, makes me talk about Catalan independence, the Catalan independence movement, which is a tricky issue, being inside Catalonia. And then, the more abstract thing. And I think I'm going to be sadly not connecting them very well, but I think that I learned a lot of sad things in this context, being in Spain and like looking at the state's reaction. I don't think the state did a really good job. I think that we got lucky. This is my personal opinion, right? So it has nothing to do with research I do. Like, I think I need to state that very, very, very strongly. I think we got kind of lucky with the government change, that everything relaxed when the PP left. And, that was actually kind of corruption scandals spiraling, and like the judiciary stepping in, and then like PP being out, and then Sanchez taking opportunities, right? So it's like, I don't know, it's like a lucky break. But let me tell you one story in this context, which I find revealing. That was very revealing for me, because of course, I'm a German. Like, I'm always saying, like, why do you want to have a smaller place? Why would you like want to have a boundary? I would be like, you should all be Europeans. You should be like, I didn't understand this at all, right? And the Catalan independentists around me were always saying, you don't understand. They don't see us as equals, and it's they and us, right? So there was the police violence on the 1st of October. And then a few days later, the king announced a speech. Okay? Now, the king is not elected. Obviously, he's not elected, right? So there's no election incentive for the king here, right? Doesn't need to think about, well, how do I gain most votes, right? This only cast, actually, it's the only, I think it's by constitution, the main role is like keep the thing together, at all costs. And I mean, all the Catalans hate the king, right? So that's kind of like, that's part of the story. But so I thought, okay, if I were the king, I would do the following. I would give 1/3 of the speech in Catalan, for sure. Yeah? He speaks Catalan. And I would throw the symbolism out there, and I would be very, very firm in saying, I'm your king. Like, I'm also yours. Like, make me, let me serve you better. Tell me what I can do better. Like, so I would appeal like that to my people, right? And he did the exact opposite. He said, like, you're outside the law, and we will come after you, and that you will be suffering, and it will be like, and actually, he confirmed what the independentists around me were saying. He was like, it's like there's this colony, and we need to pacify it. So that to me was shocking and revealing, right? Because then I thought, oh, yeah, it's these two things that are communicating with each other, and they trigger each other, right? So I do think that that's a problem very often. But now, okay, abstracting out of all of this. I think for me the key thing, and this is I think new, interestingly. I mean, I don't know whether anyone has said this, but I've watched a few episodes of F-World, and I think that I've never seen this anyone saying. I think the key about fragility is that it's at its core a statement about the future. It is not about a description of the now. Because if we say that a vase is fragile, we are not saying that it's broken. We are saying the vase might break, right? And so the kind of my criticism of how we're dealing and measuring and doing things fragility is like we let the vase fall on the floor, and if it breaks, it was fragile. And then we call it fragile. Oh, this vase was fragile. And then we throw the next one on the floor and like, oh, this one was also fragile, right? And I think that's a big problem, right? So our measurement of fragility is backward looking, and that leads to an entirely policy process that is also acting too late. And so, I mean, I do forecasting, so therefore maybe I need to say this, but we need to have more forecasting, like serious attempts of looking into the future and thinking about whether a situation is fragile now because it might lead to a breaking point in the future, right? And I think that the interesting problems are those where it's not clear that something is broken right now, but it might break, right? So the things that are broken are the easy things. They're clearly fragile. But the interesting things are the ones that are not broken yet. And so I think that gearing the policy process towards the fragile things, would be really useful.
No, I think it's hard to deny what you're proposing, and I think you're right in saying that we haven't observed this future-oriented aspect of fragility enough, and I think it's a really important one. But when you talk about these vases falling on the floor and crashing into a million pieces, it does take me from the idea of fragility and really connects it to conflict, because that is sort of what conflict, and armed conflict in particular, does to society, right? It splits up different factions, different groups, and afterwards, or it's incredibly difficult, as we know, to get a ceasefire going, as we're seeing currently in Sudan, and even as you highlight in several of your papers, the propensity of falling back into conflict once that vase is broken. It's so difficult to find all the pieces and kind of put it back together again. So, in your mind, maybe building on the vase falling down metaphor, or taking another one, if you will, what is the relationship between fragility and open conflict? Maybe both conflict in the sense that managed conflict, and also then conflict in the sense of armed, open, violent conflict.
So I think that's a very good question, and let me be very clear. I'm really speaking from the data perspective now, but I think that's a very robust kind of pattern that I'm going to talk about now. So the first thing is conflict is persistent. Conflict is something that lasts. If it starts, then it usually escalates and it keeps going for some time. And so it's a bit like the weather. Like, what's the best forecast for the weather tomorrow is the weather today. So if you're in peace today, then you're very likely to be in peace tomorrow. And if you're in conflict today, you're actually very likely to be in conflict tomorrow. So these two things are both stable. Stable. I mean, it's a bad word for conflict, but yeah, there's a stability in conflict. And the bad thing about conflict is that it's also pulling situations back into conflict. So it's also persistent in a very nasty way, in that something that pacifies after conflict then tends to draw the country or the region back into conflict. I mean, I don't know where this is coming from. Honestly, if somebody told me like, okay, these are the 5 factors that lead to this, I would be very happy. I'm sure I can think of a few, but it's just incredible how this pattern is there in the data. No matter how you look at conflict and how you look at this, it's just like peace right after conflict is very fragile, and it becomes incredibly fast, becomes more stable. So if you just keep people from fighting for a few months more, you already change the fundamental trajectory of a country. I think people completely underestimate this. Like, it's very, very, very important right after conflict to do the right things to get to a trajectory.
Could we just focus a bit on this issue of conflict and outline for us and for the audience a bit, what are the macro impacts of conflict? Because one element, of course, is the time that you just mentioned. You're stuck in it for a long time once it happens. But what are the other ones? You mentioned you can, even your previous paper about asset prices and violence, just name a few so that people can have a kind of a map, if you will.
Yeah, I studied, so large parts of my own career academically was based on that question, so I can talk for hours now. But so I think the main thing, the main thing is fear and change in expectations. Why is political violence so harmful from a macroeconomic perspective as opposed to crime? Many, many more people die in crime, homicides, than they die in armed violence, organized armed political violence. And yet, if you look at the crime data and you look at fluctuations in crime data, you don't see much movements in the macroeconomy. You see a civil war breaking out, and the economy, by and large, of course there's exemptions to this, but by and large collapses, right? And why is that? I think it is because the atrocities and the randomness of the violence just lead to a spread of fear in the population that leads to large displacements, and entire areas become kind of very difficult to travel to. Kind of transportation links are stopped. People don't go to their jobs anymore, right? And so you have the entire kind of production sector collapsing. And so this is what you see then in the macro data. You see very, very large contractions of GDP with the outbreak of a civil war. It's basically, I think it's the worst thing that can happen to a country, economically speaking. And so that doesn't recover. That's also another thing. I mean, the jury is, I think, still a bit out there. There's some controversy around this, but generally speaking, there is a lack of boom phases after Civil War, right? So it's not the same as after like Second World War, like Japan and Germany going crazy in like growth rates and booming like nuts. And Civil War, after Civil Wars, you don't tend to have that. And I think that's a puzzle. I think it has to do with these expectations about the conflict not changing that dramatically. People are still afraid. They still hate the other ethnic group. There's a lot of political kind of instability under the surface. And that's an important part of this entire collapse thing. I think the research has shown that there is strong effects on health, through like child stunting and mental health, obviously. And so you have an entire generation being harmed and scarred in that country that goes through a civil war. And so that scarring stays inside the labor force. And so you have like, you're trying to drive with the brakes on, basically. Once you had a civil war, it's like you don't get back to this dynamism, generally speaking. And so, yeah, it's a huge disaster on all fronts. And of course, you see the pictures, right? You see the humanitarian disaster. That's the most visible thing, but it's really the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot below that.
If we could go back to these parallels between sort of conflict and fragility, you had already mentioned how likely it is to fall back into conflict once a conflict ends. And you also just said that there's a major difference in the recovery from an internal conflict versus one imposed from the outside, even though the physical destruction may be the same, thinking buildings, roads, infrastructure, schools, people dying, unfortunately, but that just like you gave the examples of the Second World War, the recovery from that external conflict was much more efficient and didn't lead to another conflict. Now, where I want to go to fragility is, first of all, I really liked how you framed fragility about being about the future. And the question would be, in your mind, is the presence of conflict sufficient to make a country fragile, or is there a certain dose of conflict in particular conditions? Let's say in a more resilient country, I was trying not to use that word, but I still ended up using it, where just conflict by itself without additional factors may not lead to the same toxic outcomes that you've just described. And I'm just curious if that's the case. It's kind of a challenge. I don't expect you to say there is a case, but...
No, I think there are cases. I think that people adapt to the craziest circumstances, right? And so if you think of this fear and expectation factor, the fact that you keep having conflict in a place just means at some stage that people start to adapt to that, right? The more psychologically resilient people will stay or will come back even, or like will, let's take the example of Israel, right? So Israel is booming and it's a puzzle. It's a total outlier in all when you run regressions, what you have is residual, and like it's the residual of Israel is just off the charts, It's totally off the charts. that's, I think that there's ways to explain this. I think there's cultural aspects that are very, very important here. But I think that doesn't mean that, we shouldn't care for the next country that is about to fall into the trap, right? Because I think that the likelihood that it's going to be super resilient and whatnot is very low. And towards the intensity, I think what is important here is to think of and I usually think of at the country level because I'm more the macro kind of person. But of course, it is important to think about the extent of the conflict within the country and how it affects the economic centers of that country and how much it doesn't, right? Think of India. India is a super violent place, but there's a corner of India, of this huge subcontinent that is violent, and large parts are not violent, right? And so, of course, you're not, if you're in New Delhi, then of course you're not thinking about conflict every day, right? And so that is important aspect, because that means that you don't see it at the macro level. You do see it, and there's many studies on this. They see it at the regional level. You do see it, but at the macro level, it's not that visible.
So I was also wondering, how could we make those measurements of fragility? And we don't have to dwell too much on this, but fragility is a statement about the future. And we tend to use causal or drivers of fragility as forecasters. So in your opinion, what would be a better approach to understand fragility before it actually breaks?
Yeah, I think forecasting is really fun and useful and needed. So I would, if anybody hears this, please start forecasting for aspects of fragility. Harsh Desai is a really interesting guy. He worked for the OECD for the last fragility report, and I kept begging him, please start forecasting, right? And I don't know why, maybe they thought this crazy German guy, he's very biased or whatever, or whether there were institutional breaks to doing it or something, but they refrained from doing it. And you can show that. You can show that the measure fails exactly on these fronts. It's there is very nasty surprises, and it's exactly those countries that weren't broken before, but they are the new ones that are not picked up by that fragility measure. And I don't think it's great. Honestly, I think that's it's not fun, right? Because that is really what everybody complains about. If every second speech of Guterres on this issue is we're acting too late. It's yes, if your measure is if the World Bank has a fragility measure that is saying you have UN peacekeepers on your ground, and that's your definition of fragility. Yeah, that's literally your vase is on the floor and the pieces are everywhere. It's yes, great. That's really not going to help you get ahead of the curve, right?
But no, so you mentioned, I wanted to just do a fun thing, because we had, in another related episode, we talked to Chris Blattman, whom you I'm sure know, and you mentioned just now, Hannes, if you said if someone could explain the reasons why these countries fall back into conflict, and I think that it's kind of what Chris is attempting to do with his book, in terms of thinking about these 5 factors that he uses: unchecked interest, intangible incentives, commitment problems, uncertainty about relative strength, and misperception. So I was just really curious, and I'm sorry for kind of springing this on you, but just what are your reflections on trying to explain these types of human factors, and how does it relate to the macro level, where most of your thinking is invested when it comes to forecasting?
So let me first say that I'm a big fan of his work, and I think he's brilliant. It's very recently, on a conference, I was recommending his book, and it's very funny that he repeated these 5 factors, and I was trying to get them, and I was like, this, that, this, and then I failed. It was like a 3 or something, but I mean, I listened to the entire book, and I think it's amazing what he manages to pull in, right? So I think let me take a tangent on your question, just because I think that it's 2 different things, right? Forecasting and causal, kind of understanding the causes, understanding of why something falls back in, and like seeing the pattern in the data that it falls back in and using that pattern to predict are 2 different things. I always bring this example of like, there's this type of birds that fly very low before rain falls, right? And then farmers say, oh, they're flying very low, rain will fall, it's a forecast. Nobody gets the idea of saying like, we should trap these birds and then we're going to have good weather, right? So this would be absurd.
Did anyone
right?
try?
No, You're getting me there. Maybe there's a spiritual somehow. Maybe they're the gods of rain.
Exactly.
So you see that. So I'm a big fan of forecasting. I really love it. I really like it, but I will not be tempted into saying it has anything to do with causation, right? Exactly for this reason. It's like, it's a different thing, right? So we are forecasting and we say, look at this country, it's really dangerous. And then we need people like Chris, right? Or anyone on this podcast basically to go and say like, oh, it's probably because of this and this and this reason, right? And then you can think of policies, right? So nobody should think about policies based on our webpage, because our webpage is just completely useless for policy recommendation. It's really useful for saying like, where should you start looking for policies to do something, right? And when, so this, I think there's these 2 things. And then the micro to the macro, I think that is a very, very interesting question. And I think we don't have a very good answer necessarily about what the right level of action is at each point in time in conflict. Do you want to try top down, talk to the top elite group and be done? Or do you want to look at form a grassroots kind of initiative? In work with Christopher Rao, we studied power sharing agreements. These are usually signed by an elite group, and we find very large effects of these things on peacemaking. So I'm kind of thinking that there must be at least one aspect of this that can be dealt with at the top layer. If you have leaders that have power over their people or can lead them, right, effectively, then I think that top-down might work to some degree. And then I think that whether that lasts is then, right, if you reach escape velocity, can you escape this planet conflict? That's a different question. And I suspect that that's exactly where these other things bite. And we actually show that in our review. It's going to be published, hopefully. It's revising just a bit right now, so we should be careful. We're showing in a later chapter that it's kind of you see these changes that are access to justice, non-exclusion on the gender dimension, non-exclusion on the urban rural dimension, non-exclusion of social group and something like this. These are the things that are then in the long run most strongly associated with reductions in violence. And so kind of my interpretation of this is there needs to be a change that is kind of vertical. So the elite is talking to each other horizontally. And then at some stage, if you want to make it stable, it also needs to be the elite with their own people need to kind of find a way to rejig this relationship where people can start to complain about the elite and say hey, I didn't, get justice in this case. And so my interpretation of this is that if you always have to renegotiate, right? Chris has this beautiful like image always of the cake, and then there's this kind of piece that is large and that you're negotiating about. If you constantly, every time something changes, you need to renegotiate, right? Then this becomes inherently unstable. You really want this kind of not to be true. And I think the way to do that is to have non-excludable goods as much as possible. Like everybody always benefits no matter who's in government, right? So then it doesn't matter, right? And then all of a sudden, like even if you have changes in the power relationships, they don't immediately lead to like a complete meltdown of the agreement, right? And so that makes it more stable, I think. And so that would be my hunch. But, you know, who knows? I think this is like really a lot of work to be done still.
And just relatedly, you know, looking at the conflict forecast website as well, and connecting back to this word that slipped out of Mihaela earlier, resilience, and which also the themes that you were just mentioning in terms of having, you know, an inclusive, you know, a lot of non-excludable goods, inclusive institutions, which would be required perhaps to produce those non-excludable goods, etc. I'm just curious of how do you think of the relationship between the kind of prevention aspect that you're forecasting in your on your website, and resilience, which is now, you know, gaining momentum as the gold standard of what we should be doing in terms of prevention. So how do you think about that? And then I'll stop. I promise, connecting the micro and macro.
No. I think this is a very good question. Let me first be very splitting hair, kind of very economicsy German in this. So what's our definition of resilience here, right? Okay, so let me give you my little spiel on this. I think robustness is a system that doesn't fail, because it's very interesting. If you look at engineering problems of robustness, you see that usually it's redundant systems that have a modular structure where they're made redundant. So if like you have a flight computer, it has an electronic and mechanic part, and then when the electronics fail, the mechanic part will still keep the plane going, right? And so this is what, for example, separation of power does. You have a parliament, you have a judiciary. If people vote for a crazy president, you might relate, then that person cannot do anything that person wants to do, because there's a judiciary that will push back on some initiatives, right? So that's robustness. The system is not in complete collapse. Now, resilience is, to me, getting back up. Like something punches you in the face and you get back up. And then they punch you again in the face and you get back up again, right? So I don't think it's a great thing, like in terms of countries, to think about this. Like, oh, look at this, they had a civil war and they're back on their feet. It's like, no, please, let's not do that, right? On the micro scale, like for talking about people, I don't know. I honestly, I think it's like, it has this heroism stuff linked to it, right? We are always like Rocky, like he gets all these punches and then he's lying on the floor and then he's like bleeding and he's getting back up, and like it's this image of resilience. And like, I rather prefer people not being punched in the face, right? So I really don't like this resilience discussion too much, but that's really coming from my like perspective on this term of resilience, right? Maybe there's a different definition where it's a wonderful thing to be testing resilience. And I think maybe it gives some pride to the victims of violence, right? So maybe being able to overcome really terrible things that happen to you and then being there in the room and being like strong, you know, I think that is great. No, I think that's great. But I think that holding that too high, I think is like, maybe that's part of maybe that's part of this discussion of like, we are letting the vase fall on the floor and we're like, look how happy this vase is, despite the fact that it's 1,000 pieces, right? It's resilient, amazing, and we're celebrating it. And it's like, no, let's not drop vases on the floor, right? I think, I don't know, maybe that's my take on it, yeah.
No, and then we go after constructing new non-destructible vases or auto-reconstructing vases instead of preventing the fall in the first place.
Exactly.
So, Bruce, speaking about preventing the fall, all of what you've said until now, in a way, leads to the question about what you love to do, which is forecasting, and about why is it so valuable for prevention purposes. You were very clear about that there's obviously a reason for causal thinking to explain perhaps why the past was the past and what happened. But to predict the future, you need something else. And you have called, in other papers, you have called prediction a hard problem. So what is a hard problem, and why is conflict prediction a hard problem, and what policy implications does it have? Let's start from there and take us on the journey to forecasting.
So I'm glad you do that. That's my favorite topic. So, so the hard problem of prediction for prevention is that once you're out of this gravitational pull of the previous conflict, you've cleared, the skies are clearing, everything looks great, you're in a place where it's very unlikely that you'll have conflict, right? But those are the circumstances under which we want to be really good in forecasting conflict, because these are the circumstances where the vase is kind of on the brink of falling, right? It's not clear, this is complex, the risks are low, the baseline risk is low. So from a purely machine learning perspective, you're dealing with what's called an unbalanced data. There's lots of zeros, you're swimming in a sea of zeros and you're trying to figure out which one of those is a one, which one of those is a situation that will escalate and become a conflict. And that's a hard problem, right? It's a hard problem for two reasons. One, the unbalancedness itself, so the baseline risk being very low makes it hard. And the fact that kind of your mechanics, the machine cannot help you anymore, because machines only work with a lot of data, and because hard onsets are rare and we only have one world, there is just not that many cases you can learn from. So you cannot teach the machine all the things the machine wants to know to predict the next one. And at the same time, I think it's really important to predict these ones, because these are the ones where the vase is not on the floor. And so it's this combination of hard and important and machine fails that makes it so interesting to me. And so, go.
You said the word machine several times, and in the world of non-data scientists, machine learning is still a black box. Can we sort of break down, because we are going to move on and we want to see some examples at conflictforecast.org, but help non-practitioners, non-data scientists that care about prevention understand what is the standard sort of toolbox in machine learning, and what do you have to work with? How should they think? And what should they even maybe learn more about?
So I think that the main thing to start thinking about is the difference between supervised learning and unsupervised learning. These are the two main areas that are relevant for this problem. So supervised learning is you have zeros and ones. So that's the typical thing, is like you have pictures of cats and dogs, and somebody went and said, okay, this is a cat, this is a dog, this is a cat, this is a dog, this is a cat, this is a dog. And then you show these things to the computer and they say cat, dog, cat, dog, cat, dog. And then eventually the computer will know what a cat looks like and what a dog looks like. Okay, so that's supervising the learning. Unsupervised learning is like, you don't do that at all. You just show the computer cat and dog pictures, but you don't tell the computer, this is a cat and this is a dog. Good luck. And you might think like, but that doesn't make sense. Why would the machine learn anything? And it's like, haha, think about, I don't know whether you have children, but like, look at children, right? It's like, babies are like, they see their hand and they see, okay, this is something else than the other thing, right? So they just like, in the lingo would be clustering, like it's like segmentation. It's like, oh, this is different, this is something else. And so the first step in all of our minds is like making differences between things, right? So this is different than this, and this is something else, and this is something else, and this is something else. Like, if you have done that, then you already did a big step into like understanding the world and like making inferences about it, right? So it can be very, very useful. That's exactly what we do actually at the web page. So we have text, and we want to use that text, and we want to use text because text is fast, right? You can update it monthly or even faster if you want to, and you can use it for forecasting. And so we want to use it, but it's super complex. And I said like, okay, the machine cannot help us very much, right? So the other machine is so that we have two machines, right? One is like looking at the text, and the other machine is doing the forecasting. The forecasting one is actually a supervised machine. It's like, it has seen the history of humankind, or like at least since '89, and knows what was a zero that was followed by a civil war and what was a zero that was not followed by a civil war. So it can learn. It has this cats and dogs kind of machine, right? But there's the other machine, and the other machine is just looking at text. And now you could say, okay, make that other machine really dumb and just feed the raw text to the second machine. And the second machine will get like unstructured text, like with grammar and all the complexity of human language, and they'll try to make sense of like 400 cases of civil war. It would be completely impossible. We would just not get anywhere. We just start to see patterns in the data and say like, oh, because like in 2000, in 2001, there was a mention of like, you know, Osama. It must mean that Osama is always like a civil war word, and therefore I'm going to try to find Osama, and then every time it comes up, like it's a civil war and so on, right? So no, that's not going to help you. You need to kind of aggregate the data up. And so first what you need to do is like, that's what we do, is like you do unsupervised learning first, and then you can solve the supervised machine learning part better. So that's basically the question is like, how much data do you have to learn from in your prediction task when you're trying to figure out your taste of fragility? And if you have lots of data and lots of cases, then you can do very fancy things with supervised learning. And if you don't, then you need to do a lot of stuff with unsupervised learning or theory, right? Or like thinking about the world and sticking that into the machine.
So for those of us who are still learning about what you've just said, give us a sense of what makes a good model for you, and the basics. You know, you are trying to predict conflict, so I assume this means political violence. How do you define what you're trying to predict? And then, what are the variables you choose? You've made the case in the earlier part of our conversation that causality is not very helpful. You then focused in on the text. Tell us a bit about what goes into this mix of what we're trying to explain. Lay out a bit this kind of thinking for us.
Yes. So the first thing is we want to define something. Want to define a phenomenon, right? So you have to think about what's the phenomenon you want to describe. And what we do is we take cutoffs on the violence data, the violence data being the political violence data. And there's two databases basically you can choose from. One is augment and the other one is UCDP. They're both great. We use UCDP just because UCDP goes back in time longer. And since I'm hunting these rare cases, I want to have long timelines. I want to learn from like a lot of past, as much past as I can get. So then we take two cutoffs. I'm doing cutoffs because I think classifiers are really nicely interpretable, because then you get a risk kind of thing. Other people prefer to forecast the intensity of conflict, and so wherever that system is, it can always still do useful forecasts. Our system kind of becomes useless the moment you cross that threshold and you are in conflict. Then it's always going to predict 80%, 80%, 80%. On the webpage, if you go to Afghanistan, you'll just see this mine stuck to 90%, and it's because, you know, yes, it's because it is in conflict all the time, and then it's basically telling you if this country were to go back to peace, it would be back to conflict with 90%. And so, okay, you define a phenomenon. So we define a phenomenon as kind of like reasonably low-level violence, because that's what we're interested in. We're interested in kind of catching, kind of like the typical cases would be like all Latin American countries before things happened more recently, Arab Spring countries before they destabilized, you know, the Ukrainian war, not the latest invasion, but like the earlier, before Crimea was attacked, right? So the early ones, or like, I mean, there's many examples where you have this kind of like boiling, kind of low-level violence, which might escalate, but it's low level. And so these circumstances is what we're interested in. And so once we have that defined, you then need to think about like, what are you doing on the right-hand side, so to speak, on what you're doing with the variables that you use, how do you construct them best to forecast. And here, I think you need to really think a lot. And the interesting thing, I think, is that you need to use your human mind to think a lot, and you cannot use the machine to do the thinking for you, because the machine will just be looking for patterns in a very stupid way, and you need to think about like, what do I think as a human are really useful patterns to predict. Of course, when you have this small data problem, right, where you have just a few cases. And so what we did was we used topics. So these topics are coming from an algorithm that is an unsupervised method, so it doesn't need labels. It just like takes the text and looks at the text, and it's, for me, honestly, still today, it's a bit like this kind of like saying like technology sufficiently sophisticated is magic. Like, to me, it's still magic. It's just like you feed it 6 million texts, and it comes back and it says, this text is 20% economics and 50% politics and 10% conflict, and you know, and then it does that for all 6 million articles, and it also tells you what words are inside politics and so on. So if you go to a webpage and you click on a country and you scroll down, you see the composition of the news landscape for every country into these topics, and that's, the machine does that completely alone with us interfering with it. And so once we have these topics, we use these topics and the change in these topics to predict. Now, it's interesting that we have this conversation now, because I just finished teaching this, so I have a lot of technical stuff in my head that I would love to tell you, but let me just say a few things that are important here. For example, what do you do with the fact that there are some countries that are almost never covered in international news, right? So like Ghana, I'm just making this up, but like Ghana is not covered a lot for sure in the news. And how are you going to deal with the fact that, you know, the topics, what do you do with the topics? What share of topics do you attribute it if nothing is written on Ghana, right? And what do you do about the fact that these factors that you're capturing, which of course there is causal factors here below hidden somewhere, right? So with the birds, it's like the air pressure or something where the insects then fly low, and then that's why the birds fly low, right? So it's you're hunting the stuff, and you're thinking about it, and how do you get to that kind of smooth capturing of these factors? And so what we do is like we do something that economists will love. We use a capital stock of text. We say, text accumulates, like investment accumulates in the capital stock. So if you have a lot of stuff written in a country, that leads to a peak. For example, imagine like a financial crisis hits the country, right? Then at a sudden, the Ghana kind of like 1 article per month pattern is broken, and it has like 200 articles per month at a sudden. Now, all of them are on economics, right? And then you have this peak, and then if you weren't designing it the way we did, then the next month you would go back to baseline, right? But what we do is like we say accumulates, and so you're sitting on this capital stock of economics, and that capital stock now decays. And so you have this kind of like 1 year decline where the capital stock of economics falls, and you give the algorithm the time to use that capital stock, that declining capital stock, to forecast, because maybe this financial crisis triggers other things 3 or 4 months down the road, and you still want to have it inside the system to do forecasting. So that's, in engineering lingo, is called feature engineering, and we spend years on this. Like, this is years of work of trying things and like figuring out whether this works or that works, and so a lot of stuff is there. That's where a lot of the interesting work, but like very in the plumbing kind of work, happens.
You gave the example of Ghana, and I would assume that you would choose text that's all in one language. How do you deal with, is the technology good enough that you don't care about the language at this moment, or do you just choose a single language? The other question I had, so just to understand better what you do with cases where you don't have a lot of data, it's almost like whenever the data occurs, that capital stock, then you amortize, like amortization, I'm mispronouncing the word, I guess, over time. So then you're not sort of all spending it all in just the month it occurs. Is that what you meant when
Exactly.
you say you're leaving?
Exactly.
Okay.
So we get this question a lot, and there's actually I think there's a lot of trade-offs here. So we use the text data we can get. Online archives of digitized news content back to 89. That's consistent, right? You want consistent archives. It's just like so hard. It's really hard. And so we make our lives easy. We pick English sources, English speaking sources. And then we were lucky because I think it was MI5 in the UK government decided that it would be really important to keep tabs on the Soviet Union and what the Soviet Union is up to. And they invented this thing that's called the BBC Monitor, which is like a news service that translates international news from local sources into English. And so thank you, MI5. It's still going, and I really hope it survives, because if that thing goes, then we are screwed, honestly. And so we use that. That's like the bulk of our work. Then we use some, press agency channel. We use that as well. And then we use the New York Times and The Economist and a little tiny outlet that's called Latin News, because our coverage from Latin America was not perfect, and that's a really interesting news source for Latin American news. And so, yes, they are biased. These things are biased, right? So there's somebody who selects it. It's all the Western viewpoint, kind of. But I'm asking you, do you prefer locally biased news, or do you prefer like Western biased news? And I think depending on the country, you can come up with examples where you prefer one or the other. Right? Optimally, I think you would want to have like a cross-check kind of thing and like have the truth, if that's possible, or like close to the truth, or like that would be wonderful. It's just like, again, there we're hitting this constraint of like there's not that many archives. But actually we will probably have a lot of money very soon in our project, and we are thinking about expanding the news sources. And it will be depressing, but we're thinking about taking just other European news that are not in English, so like Le Monde and like El País, just to get like different colonial powers and their things that they care about. And then we're thinking about like, what do you think would be a good Chinese newspaper to follow, or what would be a good Russian newspaper to follow? I don't know. I'm very curious if you have any cool newspaper that we should for sure use. I'm happy to write that down.
So I have a very quick comment. Deutsche Welle in English, France 24 in English, and a whole bunch of, I even know in Romania, I read a news website in Romania, for example, that's in English.
Yes.
So there are European news services in English. I don't know how far back they go, so that might be a problem. But I would think Deutsche Welle and France 24 might go far enough back.
But I also have a question here. I mean, how do you account for censorship in the media? Because in China, you're not going to get stuff about Uyghurs. You're not going to get, Russia may report right now, a tremendous victory happening in eastern Ukraine or something. So, but if I understand you correctly, and perhaps we can feel free to share a screen at any point and walk us through some country examples. It would be great to actually see and show our viewers how this looks like. But what you're ultimately saying is you have a measure of violence that you get from UCDP, and you're trying to see what let's say the written word is about those events from the whole world that you have access to in terms of news outlets in English. And then you have a cutoff point on violence. And the whole, what you are chasing is that level of, if you will, when is the powder keg going to explode? It's not fully blown up yet. It's really not, but it's about to. And the challenge and the hard problem is knowing exactly, when to cry wolf ultimately.
Yeah. Exactly. So let me share my screen just so we can talk about specific things. So I hope this works now. Can you see my screen?
I actually have not yet.
Ah.
Okay. Yes, now we can see it.
So this is Spain, right? And there's two models at the benchmark. So this is the armed conflict model, the forecasting 12 months ahead. So every point here is like a forecast. And this is important. These are what's called pseudo out of sample. So we pretend we know here at this point, we pretend we know everything that is known until the 1st of April. That means we have the data from March, right? Basically, 1st of April means like the March data. And we are forecasting 12 months into the future. And at that point, our model said the likelihood of an outbreak of an armed conflict is 2.5%. That's fairly low. Yeah. And what you see here is like you see this kind of slight curving up and then like this jump. That's September data point. That's the jump. That must have been something in August, right? And it goes to 17%. What was that? Well, there was nothing to do with the Catalan independence. This is actually a terror attack in Barcelona, right? So UCDP actually coded political violence in Barcelona at that point. And so the machine, this is kind of the vase on the floor, right? So this is like these jumps in our models are always like, we're not better than anybody else. Basically, this is just like in hindsight, now the model says like, oh, there were deaths. So that means that it's more risky than I thought, right? And so these are, you think of these jumps as kind of failures. These are kind of like the model is adjusting to a new reality. And then, but instead of like what you would see in Germany with the terror attack, let me just do that very quickly. I hope that goes fast enough.
Yes.
Can't find Germany as a German, that's fine. So see, this is the terror attack in Germany. You see this goes up and then falls steeply down again, right? And so the model
Yes.
didn't see the terror. Well, I think it does see the terror attack coming, right? So you see like from a very, very low baseline, it's kind of risk is creeping up, and then it's like boom, the attack happens. But what happens in Spain then? So that's the mix, right? So this is the interesting mix of like terror attack, but then it doesn't rest, right? So then you have the police violence, and then you have lots of stuff happening, and it just stays above 15%. It's, for a developed country, that's more than is comfortable, right? And now let me show you what the text model thinks about this. So the text model doesn't know what the violence data looks like. We don't give the violence data to the text model. We just give it the text. And so what does the text model think? And I think this is very revealing, because the text model takes basically, I think, tracks the structural stuff of the independence movement. Right? It doesn't see the terror attack necessarily coming, but this is a model, I think, of the independence movement. Right? You see that the peak here is the police violence, and you see that it then goes back down. You see the rising instability leading up to the police violence, and then with like backs and forths, obviously, the stabilization. And so
Is that peak an overlap?
Say again?
Is the peak from the text model the same as the peak from...
This is late. This is slightly later, because this is the November. This is the kind of this one. It's like here.
Okay.
So that's the police violence in Barcelona, right? And so it's like, I think it's the here. Actually, the terror attack is here. So it's like, it's not taken that as a really strong signal of something fundamental changing in the news landscape. And so, yeah.
Yeah, so just again, so in the text model, this is the using the newspapers article, the newspaper articles,
Exactly.
And the best model, the one further up, that is basically referring to past events.
It's doing both. So the best model uses the text data and the violence dynamics, right? And so the violence dynamics are the biggest drivers of this model, because what I said before, it's like when you have violence, you have more violence. When you recently had violence, you will have a lot of violence, right? And so these are the jumps are always driven by the actual violence data, but these fluctuations around, these are always the text. They are driven by the text data usually, or like because we have dynamics inside, so you see that there's a decline here that's coming from the eta period, like there's still the outliers of the eta period, right? And it's kind of calming down from that still. So that's how the model works. And here you see the topics, right? You see there's a lot of writing about competition in sports in Spain always, because it's always very football-y. There's a lot of football stuff in Spain. Let me give you more interesting country. Let's take the United States. Well, let's take one which I think is very, very interesting to look at.
Can you show us also Germany's text model relative to the terror event? Because that would be very interesting to be able to compare.
So let me show you this, for example. Like this is Peru, right? And you see that the best model doesn't do a lot. It just fluctuates back and forth. And uncomfortable levels, right? Europeans would not be happy with this kind of like level of fragility. This is literally a level. This is literally a fragility measure, right? So this level of fragility, Europeans would not be happy with, but it's fluctuating around. Now, what you see here in the text model is that it's coming from something that's really terrible to something that's much more stable. And then recently, right, with the turmoil, the auto coup, and all that, it goes back up. And so, what you see in the text is, if you look at the March, you see a lot of this bubble. You see economics, you see civilian life, power and negotiation, national development, right? There's all kinds of things, but then there's this kind of violence, military action kind of news, and you see that that's fairly large in the last 3 months. And my hunch is that, here, that's the peak, right? January. here. That's this one. That's the jump up. The jump up is like, you can't see that here. There's no jump up here because there was no, according to UCP, there wasn't any political killing, or if there was just one or something. But then the news landscape changed completely in December 22. And so that's that jump, and that's this thing here that kind of completely changes, the attitude completely changes. And so yeah, let me just show you that landscape before, right? Before these episodes come, you see the cost of war being like really small, right? And you see that there's a lot more talk about politics, diplomacy, and the violence aspect is very small. And so that's what kind of this thing going higher leads to what leads to this higher risk estimate here.
So if I'm a German or a Spanish or a policymaker in any country trying to figure out how I should spend my time and my precious resources in the next 12 months, what are the best questions to ask your model? What can it answer? What should I not ask it? And what should be my complementary sources, kind of the top 3 things that if you use the forecasting model and then you use these few things, you can have somewhat of a good handle on where you should move. Of course, this will be different for different, for economic policy or security policy. But if there's anything you can say about the questions we should ask the model, what we shouldn't ask the model, and kind of what we should expect to receive back and what we shouldn't, that'd be really interesting.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that, we are working very hard on that, because what we realize is that we present this to policymakers and they all go, oh yeah, interesting. But then okay, so how is this actionable, right? I mean, and so what you really want to do is you want to give people an understanding of the entire conflict cycle. And let me just, actually, let me share my screen again, because I was really keen on showing this. I didn't mention this. Big part of my own journey into fragility is meeting Alexander Mark, and on a conference, actually. We met on a conference, and I was kind of like forecasting stuff, and I was like super nerdy about that and so on. And then I talked to him, and he was giving me more attention and enthusiasm than I anticipated, right? I was this econ nerd who was doing nerdy stuff on stuff, and then suddenly there's this World Bank guy who's like, he was the keynote speaker, and he was listening to me, and I was like, oh, really? That's super fascinating. Oh, wow. And so I was like, okay. And I think you will see now why I think it's so funny, because I can't share this. Wait a second. I can share this. Okay, sorry. Some technical glitches. So this is his, or I mean, not only his, but like this is the Pathways to Peace, kind of movement. And I think they were already hatching these kind of like ideas about like processes going on and like coming and going. And our thinking at conflictforecast.org is this. It's like breaking the world into little tiny like states, right, that you can define and you can talk to the policymaker about. And so
just to be clear, there are states of risk. You don't want to break the world into further states.
No, sorry. No. Sorry, states.
That's fine. So there are states of risk ultimately. Okay.
That's funny. Yes. So yeah, a state of the world being like, water boiling, water evaporating is a different state of the water than, the water being ice. So that's what a state is. And so we define these states, and the states are like, they have different characteristics. They're differently violent or not, right? And so ignore this table. It's just more like, basically it goes from like super peaceful to super ultra violent. Okay. So this is like state 1 is Sweden, Denmark, many of those countries most of the time. And so what this thing here is basically the exact same thing that I was showing here, just in a kind of mathematical formulation. Namely, what this weird thing is showing you is like, how likely is it that when you start in state 1, you end up in state 1, or you end up in state 2, or you end up in state 3, right? And so let's take state 5 as an example, right? So you start out in state 5. The most likely thing that will happen to you, if you look here, is state 5, right? Okay, so this is like confirming what I said before about like the most likely thing that can happen to you is what happened today. Now, there is a likelihood that you go to state 6, or you go to state 7, or you go to state 9 or 10 or whatever, no? And there is some likelihood that you go and de-escalate from that risk. You go to state 4, right? And so imagine that you would go to state 10. Okay, so like state 10, you were very unlucky and you go to conflict. State 10 is definitely a violent state. There's decent, significant violence going on. And so when you're in state 10, at a sudden, your future has changed in this moment, right? So what are your options in state 10? Well, most likely state 10 again. So very violent. And then also state 11 became now really dangerously likely, and state 12 became very likely. And state 12 is literally the worst thing that can happen, right? So there's a lot of deaths per month, extreme heavy violence. And the door is shut. You cannot go back all the way anymore, right? So before in state 5, if you go back to here, there was this state 4 and 3 were very likely. Now at a sudden, that door is slammed through and you cannot go back. You need to go back all the way, like through wiggling your way this way, right? On this diagonal, basically. And so,
and just to be just to be clear, the intensity of the color is probability, correct? It's not the intensity of violence. Okay.
Yes, sorry, yes. Exactly.
What you just said is if you end up in state 10, you could fall, let's say, overnight from state 2 to state 8, but you can't do another phase change from 8 to 10. You have to move back linearly through all the other states back up.
Well, according to this thing, right? So the best thing that can happen to you when you're in state 10 is that you go back to state 7, right?
Okay.
And then when you're in state 7, you start here, then you can go back all the way to 1, right? So there's some countries that go all the way back, but most countries will kind of get stuck here. Right? Look at this state 12. Like state 12, you're like bouncing around to 10, 11, 12. That's all you do, right? And so these are hot, very violent places. And then it takes time to kind of probabilistically go back and shift back. But most likely we'll actually be stuck here in this place. That's the conflict trap. So this would be the conflict trap here.
This is honestly the best illustration I've seen of A, the conflict trap, and B, the case for prevention, to be quite frank. It's very, because when you see this, if you're in state 10, you have to go to maximum or minimum state 7, and then you'll take it from there again, and it relates so clearly back to this spiral from Pathways for Peace. But just curious about the input for this, kind of the data underlying these predictions.
Yes.
Is that from the model on the conflict
exactly
forecast website?
Exactly. So this is. I lost track a little bit, but this was my answer to your question. Is like, what do you do with this, right? How do you consult people? And what we do is basically we feed all the data streams, all of them, not just one, but all of them, or like several ones, into a model that summarizes them and makes these states, right? So clearly, right, as I said before, our outbreak forecast will not be useful for these countries anymore, but we have an intensity forecast that we use to categorize this part of the table, so to speak. For this part of the table, right, the armed conflict forecast will not be very useful, but the any violence, so the much lower violence level, will be useful. And so we kind of bunch everything together into one kind of like big model. For those who speak math, this is like a hidden Markov model, right? Where you kind of the computer makes automatically sense out of the entire data and all the different variables. and then summarizes it in this way. So it's like, exactly, it's our data basically feeding into this thing. But let me show you one thing. This is, I always keep saying this to policymakers. So the left here is in the 12 states, the mean fatalities per 1 million inhabitants and the mean refugees per capita that are outside the country, that come from the country. And you see that basically it's basically flat for fatalities, and then 10, 11, 12 are violent, and you see how violent 12 is compared to the others, right? With refugees, it's a bit more a mixed picture, but you do see that, I would say, until state 6, you see relatively little refugees, and then 7, 8, 9, it starts to be more. Now, if you're focusing on like this vase that is broken on the floor, this is basically what you do. You look at these things and you say like, oh, a lot of violence, this is dangerous, we need to do something, right? And I always say that's basically like playing chess without looking ahead. It's like you move your figures, but you're never looking all the way into the future. But that's what exactly this matrix that I just showed you allows you to do. It allows you to think about like, what's the next step? What's in 2 steps? Where will I be in 3 steps, right? And then if you look at this very same data, just using this matrix, and you it's a very simple operation actually to go from a static view to a dynamic view. You see how everything pours into the lower states. You see that for something that looked completely safe, so to speak, 9, it's now much closer to 10 than it used to be before, right? And 10 is closer to 11 now, and 11 is much closer to 12 now, right, proportionally speaking. And for refugees, is even stronger, right? And so what we're working on right now is like we're thinking to help policymakers navigate kind of like their dynamic decisions using this kind of model, right? Because, okay, now comes the bad news. What I'm not showing you is like, what kind of leverage do you have over the situation at this point, right? So that's not that easy. And I think that's where the precision of the forecast is really important. Only if you have a really good forecast can you actually do something, because then you have an actionable warning, basically, right? And so we need to trade off this kind of dynamics that are underlying and can we spot this dynamics. And of course, because we have constructed this dynamics from the forecast, there is hope, right? We are very close because we have constructed it this way, but the baseline risks on this state 1 to 5 are still fairly low. And I think you need a policymaker that has some risk appetite, right? And is willing to engage in situations that most likely will not escalate.
So what's based on the map, that heat map that you just showed us with the states, where do you get the biggest bang for your buck, and sort of, do you want early action or late action? How does that work?
False positives and false negatives. I mean, it's that kind of a...
Exactly, right? And so this is a super interesting question, right? I mean, okay, first of all, you need to say something about how much do you think it costs you to engage in a situation, right? You need to put your foot down on that, because otherwise you can never make that calculus. And we have hunted this number for 5 years now. We have talked to the World Bank, we've talked to the MMF, we talked to the UN. We say, like, what does it cost you to engage in a situation where it hasn't, been escalating yet? And they say, we don't track these situations. That's part of the problem, right? Nobody knows, because everybody's just engaged in humanitarian and whatever, and peacekeeping, and that's when it's already on the floor, right? Nobody even tracks what they're doing. I mean, the World Bank, I think, is improving this, but, the basic problem is that there's no data on this. So basically, we are kind of improving our hallucinations about what this could be. And the UK government, actually, they're now the first ones who are like feeding us data, and they're willing to talk to us about their inner things. And so I'm so grateful. about this. And so we are now getting better estimates. And then let me show you the table for using these better estimates. Okay, so this is the shape I'm going to show you is under a lot of assumptions, the bang for the buck. It's literally how much do you get out for like $1 or pound or whatever you want to use, you put in. And I think it's very telling. I think it's very telling. So it's this. So the darker the color, the more bang for the buck you get, basically. These numbers here are the assumptions on how effective you are. So we are quite pessimistic about effectiveness of action. Where we say like 99% you fail, 98% you fail, 95% you fail, 90% you fail. Okay, and then we have these numbers. So like say 95% of the time you fail, and you're using our state model to implement action that shifts probabilities around slightly. The best state is state 8, and it's followed closely by all of these states. Right, you see it's fairly from like state 3 to state 7, or like there's not a dramatic difference. All this is a big plateau here from 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then it drops off dramatically. So 9, 10, 11,
can you
12.
put it in other words instead of state 8? Is that post-conflict?
Yes.
Is that...
Of course.
Okay.
Exactly. Thank you. Okay, so go back to this table. Now this is, state 1 is like most of the observations are here. This is a place where there's no violence, where our conflict risk is very low and our intensity forecast is also very low, right? So this is where most developed countries are most of the time. And then state 4, this is where it became interesting, right? This is where it became like, start to think about doing something. Our conflict risk forecast actually at a sudden is high, yeah? And so you are in a situation where 22, remember the figures I showed you before, this is literally that number, right? This 22 number is Peru, right? Is here, yeah? And so we are saying Peru, do something in Peru, right? We're saying it's really worth doing something there, stabilizing it, right? Work towards helping it. Now, in state 8, you already have violence. You see the violence starts to come up here, not linearly, but like state 5, 6, 7, 8 are already fairly violent. 8 is interestingly less violent. We have this ordering because it has super high forecast, right? So this is a situation where the system says this is probably just a little blip in the actual ongoing violence, but actually our forecast says, no, don't trust this number, trust me, it's going to go back into violence. So these are countries that are kind of recently coming out of violence, probably. They don't have violence right now, but the forecast says, yeah, you're going to go back. And this is what I said in the very beginning. I said, you really want to do something when you're just out of conflict and you really want to stabilize it, right? So I'm agreeing with this kind of peacekeeping and all that, right? I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. I'm just saying this is interesting, do something here, but then, keep in mind that there's a lot of stuff you can do before in states 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 that is also really worth doing, right? And these are definitely not places that you would read in the newspaper about, generally speaking.
So just one quick clarification, Hannes, in terms of, so if I'm looking at a country on the conflict forecast website, and I observe from the best model that the forecast for, let's say, any violence is 20% or 20 at this point, would that tell me that it is a state 4? Like, should I infer it back in that way, or is that just the wrong way to think about it?
The armed conflict one, not the any violence, but the armed conflict forecast.
The armed conflict one.
Yes. Any violence is really our super early indicator. We don't use that for a lot of policy advice because usually we are talking to foreign offices and development agencies that are trying to keep track of more violent places. And so we use the armed conflict one. If we were to track European countries, I think we would go much more to the anti-violence one. So yes, but the armed conflict above 20 is a good indicator of real trouble, I think.
So now, if you think a bit, I mean, in a way you've already answered part of this question, but if you think now of the proverbial policymaker, that they can be in the UK government if you want, ultimately they are being asked to do something about a problem that will be hopefully solved in the future. And one question I had is, does your model say something about a theory of change in terms of what they should do differently? Maybe when they should do it. I mean, clearly you demonstrate very clearly when the time is when is the right time to act. But then also maybe to go back to an earlier question we discussed, the same person will most likely have reports from various agencies. Those agencies could be anything from development organizations writing their strategy, saying this is how we see the country going in the future, to more on the, let's say, mysterious side, intelligence agencies that have human intelligence on the ground. They combine it with signal intelligence in the sky, and they come up with their own report. And very interestingly, usually countries have a kind of structured process to go through what's reliable, what's unreliable intelligence, and then what's high confidence, what's not a lot of high confidence. So how would you carve out in this space the unique value that conflictforecast.org can provide? When which cases, and how to think about what your research does, and how does it augment human decision making?
Okay, so I think that's a very interesting question on many respects. Actually, I think let me first say that I think that the way I think about this project is partly as a lobbying instrument. So I think of it as inside an organization, you have somebody who is responsible for a country, and they think that country is escalating, and then they can go to our webpage and they can look at the webpage and they say, oh yes, they're also saying this, and then I can go to my boss and can say, look what's happening in Peru right now, we really need to do something about this, right? So it's like an objectification of something that maybe people believe already. So I think that that's one way of looking at it. Obviously, I hope that sometimes we are smarter than the average person, right? And so it's also like informing policy processes. And as I already indicated, I really hope that it's doing that for the situations which are less tangible and it's like less clear kind of where we are, right? But I think that the third target is really the kind of academic community almost in like providing data, right? And like you've seen me basically drawing that matrix, and Johan said like, look, this is really interesting, right? And I felt thank you by the way, so that's grateful for that. That's exactly what I think the kind of thing you can do with this kind of data, and you cannot do that with this kind of data, right? And so therefore this data is valuable without like even abstracting a little bit out of this kind of like narrow, like just a timeline. And so it has that value. And let me just say one more thing, and this is something that it's really important to think about, like how is the forecast done? How do we calculate performance and all that? I do think there's two ways to look at the webpage. One is like a ranking of all countries at every month. You say strategically, what's our best bang for the buck? Like if you allocate resources across, or attention and resources across everything. And the second one is like for the country expert view, where it's like I'm tracking my country over time, and I think, oh, something is happening, right? Because also like you can do the opposite, right? So be like, I'm working on the country and I'm trying to mediate between the conflict parties, and they are not shooting each other for a month. And then I see on controlforce.org like the thing falling, right? And be like, oh, I'm changing the world. Like this is happening, right? So like, I think that that's kind of like also this non-depressant thing can happen where you like, we are part of like the stabilization drive where it's like, yes, keep going, keep doing what you're doing, right? And I think that's also important.
So one part, and you actually, there was a perfect segue you just did in terms of saying the stabilization drive, because in the hard problem paper, you also discuss how the model is able to also provide propensity scores for that can be used in cross-country comparisons, looking at the role of stabilizing factors. So I was just really curious about if you could talk a little bit more around the role of stabilizing factors and how we should think about them in this kind of cross-country comparison and what we could draw out from that on a policy level.
So yes, this is literally work we do right now. So this is this paper that I mentioned before on power sharing agreements, okay? Let me tell you this little story about power sharing agreements. If you look at the world and you look at where have people tried to do power sharing agreements and where have they not tried to do power sharing agreements, and then you just compare these two things, and then you come to the conclusion that power sharing agreements are an absolutely idiotic, destructive idea, because every time you have a power sharing agreement, there's violence following the power sharing agreement. Now, that's a bit like saying, okay, you have this super specialist heart surgeon that only gets the worst cases on his table or her table. And then you look at like the average person in that city and the people that end up on that table, and you're like making the comparison between the two, and you're saying, oh, that person is dangerous, keep people away from that person because, you know, there's a lot of deaths around that person. No, yeah, okay, right? It's because the selection problem here is so big that there's such a strong selection onto that person's table that you see worst things happening. And that's literally the thing that's happening in power sharing agreements. Power sharing agreements are not implemented in Switzerland right now. They're not implemented in Sweden right now because they don't need this, right now. They have strong institutions. Power is shared effectively. Switzerland being like a really crazy example of like extreme power sharing institutions, you know? And so yes, right? They're flying around the world and they're doing stuff and it looks really bad. And the news is reporting, oh, another agreement with the Taliban that didn't work, right? And then I think our paper is a little bit therapeutic, because what we do is we say, aha, you can use our forecast and you can say, what are the kind of situations under which power sharing agreements were signed? Look at the forecast at that moment, or like right before the signature of the power sharing agreement, and then look for an observation in another country in another time that had a similar forecast. Okay? And now do a fair comparison. Now look at like what happens in the aftermath of an agreement versus a non, so this is this propensity score matching idea kind of. It's a bit different, but okay, I can go into details, but like it's more or less, you get the idea, right? So it's like comparing at a sudden, you're comparing people that are landing on this super heart surgeon table and people that don't land on it, but they have the same heart condition. Yeah? And now you're looking at survival rates, and it's crazy. So these things work really well. Violence reduction is 60% of violence reduction. 60%, 60. Yeah? So that's really big, and you know, good things happen, right? And of course, not always. That's on average, but if that's the average, like think of what that means, right? So some don't work, and then some reduces by 100% or like 80%. And so I think this is almost like a therapeutic thing, right? Where you're like saying like, yeah, keep doing it. Like your work is valuable, even though you don't see it, even though the world tells you, you know, it's not working, it is working, right? Because your comparison group is so messed up that you need to calibrate carefully for that. And our forecast is actually a way to do that. It's a way to help people make sense of the world, and especially the violent world.
what you just said right now, and I really like the fact that you're trying to sort of lobby people through this tool, because you had said earlier that there's no data and that people are just sort of reacting. And when you look at the program, sort of, you have got conflict, you have humanitarian programs going. It's almost like people are acting just on the tactics with zero strategy. Like in chess, you just care about this move, not necessarily about winning the game. So I'm curious now, because you're using, we talked about data sources earlier, and you're using available data, but not ideal data. What data would you want to see? Because everything we've just talked about also depends on people actually acting across time, right? So you need action and continuity of actions. So what data that if you could just wave a magic wand, would you want to see, or you would hope that people would start keeping, or what would be revealed? Because there's plenty of programs that were put in place in countries in the past, and there were plenty of internal conversations that are not public and you don't have access to. But would you want access to them? So what kind of data do you want? Any data?
I have a very clear wish list. So the data I beg people to keep is policy interventions, a record of policy interventions that were implemented, because I think it's ultra frustrating that, and I mean, there is people start to do this, right? But very consistently, systematically, also going back in time, right? Because you need long timelines. And let me tell you how important that is, because there's something that we didn't talk about, and this is like a big weak point of our system. And let me review this. We are pretending, while we're doing the forecast, that nobody does anything, right? That's nonsense. That's not true, right? So people, all this time where you see this curves jumping around, like people trying all the time to influence this, right? I mean, in good and bad ways, but like they're trying, right? Now, what would happen if we had a good measure of what people were trying at the time? Okay, so we could do two things. We could first say, okay, I can actually do causal estimation of whether this was effective. So we could get much better estimates of what's a good policy. Because I can always do that exactly what the trick I just said that we can do like a risk forecast and then look at like what people did, and then we can code these two together and we can match observations that are kind of the same and then look at how effective policy is. And at the same time, I can improve the forecast, right? Because the forecast actually now is something that ignores something that might be really, really important for the forecast, right? Because maybe there was a big risk, but then people did a lot of very good stuff, and then it goes back down, and it looks a bit as if our forecast was wrong, but it was just like our forecast was spot on. It's just like it doesn't materialize. And so actually what the machine nonstop learns is that, oh, false positive, right? And then it starts to not trust itself with the risk, because maybe people were doing lots of good stuff, right? And so of course, this would become much more a problem if people start listening to our webpage, because then our forecast would become useless, right? The moment people react very strongly to our forecast and do important and useful things, our forecast becomes nonsensical, right? Completely starts bouncing around where like we will not see anything.
So your success is your demise.
Exactly. I think it's a good, I think that says something good about me, that I'm working on something that will basically make me useless. So having policy measures is the key thing. Having a good record for institutional learning and for us learning from institutions, having a record of what somebody did at some stage and how much they spent, if that was possible, right? So that would be amazing.
So just to dig a little deeper, you would want just the formal policy documents, or would you also want to understand how they got developed? And I'm thinking here, country A, country B, almost similar risk. Country A, you do a policy where there's a lot of, let's say, there's not a lot of risk adverse people on that team, because we can't forget the human X factor, versus country B, where there was some pushback and maybe internal conversations watered down a similar policy.
Yeah.
So would you want to see, and I'm thinking here, an ideal world, because we've all seen the behind closed doors, which is in Outlook, the conversations that say, maybe we shouldn't try this, maybe we should try that. What level of detail would you want to see, especially, and obviously with all the resources that you would need to be able to process all those mountains of data?
I think it gets difficult there again, right? Because you're again back to this problem of having not that many cases. Maybe you gain a little bit of cases because now you can look at the risk instead of the actual realizations. So you're gaining. But I think that it would be quickly overburdened if you start to. So I don't know. I think like the most important 5 policies and how they're implemented would be in a very crude way would be really useful already. Of course, but you could do standard econ things if you knew how these things come to being, right? Then you could have instruments for this is a good instrument for a policy action, why it was implemented, right? You could do much better causal inference, and so that's a possibility. But I think that having better insight into the policy process would more help understand the causal effect and not help with the forecast that much, because the forecast just cannot take that much in and it cannot deal with that much information.
So I have one more question on this topic, and that is ChatGPT. Mm-hmm. How is ChatGPT impacting your forecast or your work in general? And it's not just ChatGPT. ChatGPT is just the one that's most well known. And I'm thinking here, media outlets are starting to use it to write articles. There's plenty of errors. So there's good and bad. It's kind of a mixed bag. And I'm curious how you're thinking about it.
I think I don't know how it's going to impact the world, right? And then it's going to impact us through the world. I mean, that's definitely going to be true. It's going to impact news reporting perhaps, and that's going to affect us, but it's going to make news reporting a little bit cheaper. And so I don't think necessarily negative on that front. But the first thing I think about, okay, somebody needs to get it to read the text, make summaries of the text that are much better than what the topic model would do, right? And then use that to forecast. I think I'm sure there's a paper to be written and a website to be developed using ChatGPT output on text to do forecasting, right? I mean, that must, if you do this right, that must be better than what we do, for sure. I don't think it's that easy, but I think it's definitely worth a try,
And you don't have any concerns about potential errors in media sources that might be using it to write articles, because it's been found to confabulate things.
But we don't. So it's funny because if you would, I guess if you would use ChatGPT to interpret the output, then it might be troublesome, because then you could pay attention to subtle detail. But the topic model, right? Think about the way it thinks. It's like sports, economics, right? So whether somebody writes the wrong word for that thing, or the grammar is a little bit off, or the grammar is amazing, ChatGPT. But if events are not, it's a bit like the errors, the kind of errors that people get very upset about with ChatGPT. I think our system is completely way more obnoxious about this than ChatGPT, right? So, think of it this way, right? So, we have this little child that is babbling, and ChatGPT is an adult speaking. So, if the adult does it wrong, very likely our system will not realize this. So, I doubt that will really. Of course, if it's totally made up, I think yes, but I don't think that's what people are upset about. Fake news will be a problem, but it will be a problem on all levels for all aspects of life, not just for our system.
So I can't resist to ask you one more technical question before we head towards the end of the conversation.
No worries. No, fire away.
So you may have alluded to this already, but when you look at the news sources, there is a way to, there are at least two dimensions of the news sources of an article that could be relevant. One is what is reported. So whether there are, let's say that the facts are right, whether there was a terrorist attack, and unfortunately, even if 2 people die, it's a tragedy. It will be more significant to your model if the number is 20 or 40 or so on. So is the accuracy, is it right? But then there's also the sentiment, if you want. There's also the fact that maybe there's no numbers mentioned, and maybe you have economics or politics or instability as one of the big topics. But the article can be tremendously subjective. I mean, the same. Let's say, you could have, for instance, a meeting of the elites for the purpose of a power sharing agreement, but one news source could say, how great it is that the elites have met, and this is a step forward. Even though no progress was today, this was the first time that this has happened after a long time, or maybe never. And then another news source could say, of course, it's horrible. It's horrible that no agreement was done and everything is doomed. So do you have a way to control for these and for these kind of nuances? And if not, is this or any other, let's say, frontier of where the forecasting science, if you want, that you're trying to promote can go?
So we don't do this. We don't have sentiment inside the model. We have played around with it. We have tried to use it, and it didn't improve the forecast. And let me tell you why I think that it doesn't. It's exactly those reasons that we were talking about before. Like, if the US media talks negatively about something that's happening in China, maybe that's more telling about the US media than the situation in China. Therefore, maybe you don't want to use sentiment, because that will just lead you astray in terms of what's going on, right? And also, and I think this is really important, I think we are operating on a level where it's not even worth doing a lot of censoring, because whether the composition is more economics and more, when conflict, okay, but there's so much stuff inside our model that is not conflict that I'm having a hard time thinking of that dictator who would then even try to suppress that, right? So I think it's exactly because of this kind of crudeness of the model that we are able to get it off the ground for most countries, and it works, right? And then you're training on as many cases as you can going back in time. And so that's why it's able to track autocracies. Because even autocracies will have these kind of, okay, economics goes down. Economics going down, by the way, is a bad thing usually. And judicial procedures go up, right? Police arrests go up. Okay, our model will for sure show a high rising risk, right? And I do think that's the Chinese media might totally do that, right? They might there's an anti-corruption drive we're doing, we're going after these bad guys and girls, and yeah, right? So it's exactly in this non-sentiment and the more topic-wise thinking about the world that I think we have a strength.
So I think we should head towards wrapping up. And we want to ask you about the future. What's in the future? What are you excited about in terms of conflict? What are you excited about working? Maybe you're trying to switch away from conflict. If you're working towards your own demise, if your success is assured, then you're going to have to find a different project.
In other words, forecast the forecast.
Yes, forecast the forecast.
Forecast the forecast.
Your best meta forecast, please.
Okay, let me go to my webpage. No, I think that So there's literally last 2 weeks we had very good news. The German government will start financing us, and very excited about this.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. And they actually want us to do multidimensional fragility. They want us to move away from just tracking conflict and tracking other things as well. And so in the next more or less 2-3 years, we will probably expand the webpage. Maybe the webpage, but definitely their internal procedures with like additional measures of fragility. And I'm very excited about that. I'm very interested.
Still in the realm of forecast, or are you
yes,
also
of course. Because my
Okay.
project application was the story of essentially the story of the vase is inside the project document, right? It's saying like, we have really beautiful multidimensional fragility measures, but they're not explicitly targeting forecasting. We should do multidimensional forecasts. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to do multidimensional forecasts. We're going to do fiscal, perhaps. We're going to do gender. We're going to do climate change. And then, I don't think we're going to follow the temptation to merge them again, but we're going to have these 3 or 4 or whatever dimensions, or 6 separate, and they're going to live there separately, and they're going to classify countries differently depending on what the measure is. And I think I'm very, very interested in that, because of just I think that some countries are definitely, Paul, you know this, right? Working at the IMF, it's fiscal fragility is a really, really important aspect of our world. And having a good measure on that would be very interesting. I'm actually going to reach out to the IMF for sure very soon, asking what they are doing, what data sources they're doing. And default risk would be one obvious thing, right? But I think there would be other things that we do. Actually, I want to go to this, there's a political economy, so I'm diverting now again, but there's a political economy literature on austerity and how harmful austerity is to societies. Yeah. Right? And so what I'm really interested in is when is the government forced to implement austere measures? And I would say that's a really interesting fragility measure.
So on the austerity side, one it's anecdotal, but I think it's the prototypical story of Ceausescu's fall in Romania. In the 1980s, he started to ration everything to pay the foreign debt. He self-imposed an austerity that almost no one else called for in the name of independence and autarky. Of course, there was a huge sort of the interest rates went up after the oil crises and so on. But so there was some reason to be concerned about the debt. But what he did is, in the same time, literally impoverished the country for 10 years. While building the second largest building in the world, which was supposed to be the kind of parliament or whatever Congress that he envisioned, and it led to revolution. It was literally like shock therapy gone completely wrong in the worst possible way,
Also, you teach people, so put on your professor hat for us for a moment. What should we learn? What are you? When you're writing proposals and you're sending them out, or you're talking to various institutions, you must be observing knowledge gaps. And what are those knowledge gaps, and what should we all as professionals, your students have far more time ahead of them, right, to learn, and they might be more well-versed in things like data science, for example. But in general, what should we all learn in order to face the uncertainty of the future and the complexity of it better?
Wow, that's you're asking, that's tall order. I think what I observe, I do talk to policymakers a lot, right? And what I observe is that there is organizationally very little time to look ahead. Because it's always the next crisis that keeps people busy. And so I don't think it's the individuals necessarily, and I don't even think it's necessarily the kind of wrong skill set or the wrong attitude even, right? I think it's just like there is a certain rush to kind of the next crisis, and our attention as humans gets drawn to this, and I think organizations get drawn to this a lot. And so if I have like an outside person's view, I would rather say I don't think it's a skill, but I think it's attention that is required to different sets of circumstances.
So it's almost like short-sightedness is an emergent property of the systems we have in place.
Exactly. I think there's a myopia.
So maybe we don't need to learn, but maybe we'll become more aware, and institutionally we demand more.
Or we apply the solution to myopia, which is glasses.
Should we bring back salons?
Yeah.
The answer to that, of course, is yes.
Yes, I agree.
No, I think we should. I think, honestly, if it's almost like in the architectural design of organizations, international organizations, that you could do changes where people would bump into each other and like have these mini salons or something like this, or like, right? I think there's something to be gained on that front. It's just, yeah, no,
that's a conversation for a salon.
Yeah, no, I think that organizationally there's big improvements to be had, but I think, you know, one thing is I always think back of Max Weber and what he said about like the best organization is the rational bureaucracy, but then it wouldn't be a democracy anymore. So then what do you do, right? And I think that we face that trouble, right? We face that problem that we have like leaders who might have very different incentives because it makes them myopic in a sense, right? They want to win the next election, or like they just want to be seen doing something, right, about this. And then maybe we have technocrats, maybe not everybody, but we definitely have technocrats that are understanding like, oh, this is going to go bad. We need to do something now, right? But nobody listens to them, and then until it's too late. And so I think it's this kind of, I mean, my experience with the FCDO was exactly this. Like I had super smart people there, like very motivated, super smart, and they get all withdrawn from the project. We were about to do these things that I just showed you, have a big bash and like showing this to the FCDO, and then they get all withdrawn and nobody listened to our output because Ukraine war happened. They got all allocated to doing something with Ukraine, right? So there was no, right? And I'm not blaming them. I'm just saying that this is that's how it goes. Like the next big crisis is always like the one that's dominating everything. And so I think that's part of the problem.
Actually, I would disagree with you. I think we should blame the systems and us people that are part of the systems if we don't take ownership of them. Because I have stories like yours, very similar, where you get to day of, and then the next day something happens and a government falls, and then everything you've done for the past 2 years just falls apart.
Yeah.
So, and in that case, that is not okay, because who loses? It's actually the most vulnerable people in society, and not necessarily in the societies we live in.
Yeah, but you know, my story is a happy one because they did come back to me now. So it's exactly the same people.
Great.
They wrote me back and they said, look, it's really interesting what you do. And they pushed us. They pushed our team inside the FCDO, and they said we should really listen to what you're saying. They want to introduce me to their strategy department. So there is, like, because these people care, right? And then they have the time back. They have the time back, and then they come back. I don't know. I think it's almost like a personal thing. They say, "Oh, I want to talk to this guy because I think that's really valuable," right? And so, I do think that if you give people time to look a little bit ahead, and then they might be able to do that. But you're right, Paul. Maybe not everybody has the capacity, but I think that at least give those that have the capacity do it.
So Hannes, this was a wonderful conversation. This is our longest so far. It's been more than 2 hours and absolutely fascinating. Before we let you go, can you tell everybody where they can find you online? They already know conflictforecast.org. Any other place where they can reach out or find your work?
I think that my own webpage, hannesfelixmueller.com, I think it is. Let me see. I think it is. Yes. hannesfelixmueller.com is a good place to start. I'm also on LinkedIn if you want to contact me there. That's also fine. I'm happy to link up with everybody.
So thanks again. This was absolutely wonderful. And thanks to our audience. Thank you for tuning into F-World and for making it through the 2 full hours. We hope you found this conversation as interesting and inspirational as we did. And please do subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you want to know more about us, about F-World, please visit our website at f-world.org and follow us on Twitter at F-World Podcast. Same on Instagram. Thanks so much for listening.